Good afternoon. My name is Larkin Harris, and I'm an environmental health specialist. It's a pleasure to be here in Russellville talking to the community about the health effects of living next to Arkansas Nuclear 1. Without any further ado, we can go ahead and get started. All right, to begin, I was going to give a bit of background on Arkansas Nuclear 1 and Entergy, which is the parent company. So Arkansas Nuclear 1 has been producing power here in the Arkansas River Valley for around 40 years. As most people know, it's located in London, which is just outside of Russellville. And it was actually a facility that was built in two stages. So it has two reactors. Unit 1 was constructed in December 19th, 1974. That was the first day of construction. And Unit 2, its construction began 6 years later on March 26th of 1980. Both of these reactors are pressurized water reactors, and they work very similarly, except they have one important difference, which I will explain a little bit more later. But these reactors provide the state of Arkansas with the majority of its power. It provides both commercial and residential Entergy customers, which is about 700,000 Arkansans throughout Arkansas, with 56% of the total energy demand. So pretty much if you're living in the state of Arkansas, a majority of your power is coming from the Arkansas Nuclear 1 power plant. This facility provides the state with power, but it also provides us with some economic impacts. And that comes in the form of employment. Entergy employs over 1,000 employees at the Arkansas Nuclear 1 facility. 900 of those are full-time workers, and 100 of those are contractors. Aside from employment opportunities, Entergy also donates locally over $100,000 to local nonprofit organizations in 2020, and over $230,000 was given to the River Valley United Way for distribution to partner agencies in 2020. So Entergy and Arkansas Nuclear 1 are fully ingrained into the community here in the River Valley. They're very important to the state of Arkansas as far as meeting those energetic demands. So before getting into the health effects of living near nuclear power plants, I think it's important to address what happens when things do go awry. There's a lot you can learn from history. So here I'm going to talk about 3 nuclear accidents really quick: the Fukushima Daiichi, 3 Mile Island, and Chernobyl disasters, which were all nuclear accidents that were pretty well covered in the media. There's even a TV show about Chernobyl now. There's a few primary causes that usually result in nuclear disaster. These are natural disasters, such as earthquakes, and human errors. And what these do is cause damage to the fuel-containing structures. So what happens is when the cooling systems fail, there can be a meltdown, which results in a radiation release. And elevated temperatures and pressures within the reactor can even result in explosions. This threat is typically minimized by a surrounding core that has a steel vessel, which is then in turn surrounded by an airtight, steel-reinforced concrete containment structure that can contain radioactivity indefinitely in the event of something going wrong. In the 3 Mile Island meltdown, there was a containment structure that was effective, so there wasn't a whole lot of radiation release. In Chernobyl, there was not a containment structure, and that is why there were so many issues after that disaster. To the date, there have not been any identifiable health effects from 3 Mile Island except for a small spike in cancer incidents immediately after, but other than that, everyone was healthy. These are extremely rare, preventable, and they're not as big of a threat anymore due to these containment structures. All right, now let's talk a little bit about radiation, which is what we're all here to learn about. So this is the main concern most people have when considering living near a nuclear power plant. But be warned, or not be warned, rest assured there's only a very small amount of radioactive gases, liquids, and direct radiation that can leak out of these facilities. If you lived within 50 miles of a nuclear power plant, you'd receive an average radiation dose of 0.01 millirems per year, which is just a tiny, tiny amount. I've got the statistics here. These are everyday activities with the same probability of resulting in death. So everything listed here has the same probability of causing you to die. 2 days of being in New York City, riding 1 mile on a motorcycle, eating 40 tablespoons of peanut butter, and being exposed to 3 millirems of radiation. And like I said a second ago, within a year, people who live within 50 miles of power plants are only exposed to 0.01 millirems per year, extra from the normal baseline radiation. So as you can see, there's some statistics here to explain to you how minuscule the amount of radiation leaking out of this facility is, and to kind of paint a picture view for how dangerous that radiation is. So for everyone living within 50 miles, it really is not a big concern for everyday life. All right, so everyone wants to know what happens if you are exposed to high doses of radiation. Well, the main concern is DNA damage, which can cause some molecular effects that can be pretty significant. Most people think of cancer when you're talking about radiation exposure, but radiation can also cause cell dysfunction, cell death, or other things such as dysregulation of specific protein factors. There are a few things to consider when you're thinking about the effect of a nuclear exposure. That's going to be the exposure type, the tissue exposed, the radiation type, the depth, the total dose, and the time period. So by type, that could be total body exposure, partial, internal, external. Some areas of the body are more sensitive to radiation than others, such as the thyroid. As far as types of radiation go, that could be gamma or beta. Could be a high or low energy radiation, and it could have a different depth, which is dependent upon how high energy the radiation is. What also is important is the total dose you receive and the period of time over which you receive that dose. All of those can affect how the outcome of that radiation is going to affect you. Both short-term and long-term radiation exposure can cause effects in every organ system in the body, but it can do so in different ways. Acute radiation syndrome is kind of the scary thing that people think of when thinking of, I'm outside of Chernobyl and it explodes. You're probably going to get acute radiation syndrome, but you're also keep in mind, you're being exposed to huge amounts of radiation. But the effects are kind of all over the place. Hematologic, the gastrointestinal effects, there are cutaneous symptoms, and that's what mainly causes the mortality. And for the everyday person here in Russellville and the surrounding communities, this is not something you need to be concerned about. The only people in Chernobyl of all the surrounding communities that experienced this syndrome were those who were at the scene of the Chernobyl explosion. So those are the first responders and the actual workers. The long-term effects of increased exposure, this is what most people would associate with cancer. But actually, it's kind of interesting. Studies have shown the victims surrounding the Chernobyl area did not have any increased risk of leukemia or non-thyroid solid tumors as of today. Now, this may change as we improve our cancer registries and have better follow-up. But I think it's an interesting statistic that these people have not had any worse outcomes thus far, even though they were exposed to those higher levels of radiation temporarily. Additionally, surrounding 3 Mile Island, which was another site of nuclear leakage, there was an initial temporary spike in cancer diagnoses in the years immediately following the accident. But a lot of people are thinking this may have been done to increase screening. A lot of people wanted to study this effect, so a bunch of people were out there looking for cancers. If you look for more cancers, you're going to find more cancers. So as far as radiation exposure goes, there's really not a whole lot to fear unless you are exposed to these huge doses, which, as long as everything goes well, should not be a factor to consider. Other effects that the nuclear power plant can have on the community is thermal pollution. So nuclear generators produce electricity by heating water. Uranium or plutonium undergoes fission and energy is released. And you have two sources of water which are very important to understand, to kind of think about how this thermal pollution affects the surrounding area. There's processed water and cooling water. Processed water is something that actually flows into the reactor through pipes, and within those pipes it's heated to a steam that's approximately 315 degrees Celsius. This steam can then pass through turbines at an accelerated velocity, and that generates electricity as it spins the turbines. And that's how the generators at Arkansas Nuclear 1 work. But in order to maintain the efficiency of the system, you also need another source of water, which is your cooling water. This is essentially, its job is to cool the processed water so that it condenses and can be pumped back into the reactor to be heated again. So cooling water at Arkansas Nuclear 1 is pooled from Lake Dardanelle, and it allows for the processed water to be reused. Heating water can either then be heated cooling water is then either pumped back into Lake Dardanelle or released from a cooling tower, which is the large tower we see. This process is favorable because it means that radioactive water and really any source of radiation is never released from this closed circuit. But this does come at the price of thermal pollution, which can have some impacts to the surrounding areas, including Lake Dardanelle and our air. These processes use huge amounts of water, and actually the United States Geological Service estimates that 41% of all freshwater withdrawals in 2005 were from nuclear power plants. Heated water has decreased dissolved oxygen levels and can cause a significant rise in pH. The reason for this is the warm water just can't hold as much oxygen as cold water, and the rise in pH can be associated to biological processes associated with increases in decay. This decay can also result in eutrophication, which is a process where algal blooms and things such as that cause blocked sunlight, which kill the aquatic life down below. So essentially, once you have a bunch of decayed matter in your waters, algae thrive. They thrive so much that they block the sun from getting to the plants and animals below that need that sunlight to survive. Additionally, heated water causes accelerated metabolism in fish because they're cold-blooded. So this can result in malnutrition, which can further be exacerbated by eutrophication if it is destroying the food supply for these organisms. When considering the health effects of a nuclear power plant, it's also important to consider how it affects the air around you. I included this tweet here. Nuclear power may have prevented 1.8 million air pollution-related deaths. That comes from NASA. I thought this was an interesting tweet as it kind of points out that nuclear power is pretty clean compared to things like coal, natural gas, and oil. When you're burning those, you're releasing all sorts of nasty chemicals into the environment, which can cause respiratory illness, cardiovascular illness, all sorts of problems related to poor air quality that you don't have with nuclear power. The reason that is because the only thing released from these nuclear power plants is steam, just the energy, but you do have some effects of thermal energy as we noted on the previous slide. A lot of people will say that nuclear power is a source of carbon zero energy. I included the word nearly here because I think it's important to consider the cost, the energetic cost of both mining those radioactive compounds, which are often deep in the ground, and then transporting those to these nuclear facilities. While it may be carbon zero to burn these energy sources here in Arkansas at Arkansas Nuclear 1, it's going to take a lot of burning a lot of coal, natural gas, all sorts of energy sources to get that radioactive material here. You think about it, you got to dig all that stuff up, you got to transport it to a coastline, ship it by boat, put it on a train, and all that's requiring very heavy-duty equipment to prevent any kind of radioactive spill. So it really can add up. While it is certainly better than burning coal, natural gas, and those things, it is something to consider that it's not completely carbon zero. This is an interesting statistic here that nuclear power produces more energy than solar, hydro, wind, and geothermal sources combined. So it's a huge, huge source of relatively clean energy when compared to these other sources. What a lot of people don't like to include in their brochures about Arkansas Nuclear 1 and other nuclear power plants is that steam actually can be a greenhouse gas, and it can contribute more to global warming. Well, that's not going to immediately affect you here in Russellville or cause any immediate health effects, on a huge long-term global scale, that is something we need to consider, the effect of increased temperatures and more drastic changes in our weather. So the best way to prevent any kind of negative exposure or harm to your friends and family is to have a good idea of the emergency plan in the event that something does go awry. So I'm going to kind of walk through the process here of how things will go in the event there is an emergency. Within 15 minutes of any kind of malfunction at the plant, Entergy is required to notify state officials. Those state officials then have 15 minutes to send a message to the surrounding community, and that will usually be through the emergency warning system, the sirens that we hear every Wednesday at noon. Radio alerts will also be broadcasted to Dardanelle, Russellville, Danville, Atkins, Ola, and Clarksville, and pretty much that's going to be your source of information as you're leaving town. They want you to get in your car and follow the evacuation route signs to just get out of Dodge and get as far away as possible to avoid any unnecessary exposures. The Arkansas Department of Health recommends you take some necessary items for a few nights, such as baby products, maybe some stuff to make a little pallet, clothes for a few days. You should know that if your children are at school, they will all be taken to different locations, and there's a map on the Arkansas Department of Health website which will show you where your kids will be in the event of any kind of nuclear disaster. Thank you all for your attention. Just got a few slides here of my sources, and hope you learned something about Arkansas Nuclear 1 and its health effects.